We're continuing with the look at the Post-Reformation Catholic Church, the church after the Council of Trent. There were three popes between 1566 and 1590. They were Pius V, Gregory XIII, and Sixtus V. Every one of them continued this idea of correcting the abuses in the church. And they worked to improve the organization. I think I told you that there's an ongoing process of trying to improve the organization in the church. And a lot of it has to do with, as I mentioned, power corrupts. And so ordinary people get involved, but when they rise in the system, then oftentimes things happen to them. So this improving the organization will go on endlessly. And the other thing they were most concerned with is improving the church's teaching ability. And we mentioned that with regards to educating people. You see, when a priest is trained at this point in history, not today, but when a priest is trained at that point in history, he can expound all of Catholic theology from church teachings and documents and the catechism and stuff like that. And when we encountered the Protestant Reformation, remember, the basic thing the Protestants had to do in order to break away was to find a new authority. And their authority was the Bible. So we would argue from some position of papal documents and things, but they didn't recognize the Pope, so why did they care? And they would argue from certain positions of the Bible, and since we had the Pope to teach us, why did we care? And so they were really very much at odds for a long time. And the Reformed papacy that this was exactly what the church needed to spread the reforms of Trent throughout the entire church. These popes regulated the liturgy. They promoted Thomistic philosophy and theology. They distributed the Bible widely, which was unusual in the church at that time. And they published a basic catechism. And as I mentioned, they opened seminaries. I thought it was very interesting when we came through the seminary after Vatican II. I was in before and then after Vatican II. But when we were in the seminary after Vatican II, everything was presented from the Scripture thing, that we've approached it from Scripture. We oftentimes included quotes from papal documents, particularly as they interpreted and looked at the Scriptures. But we basically worked on the Scriptures. And I thought it was very curious that probably 10, 15, 20 years after Vatican II, I forget how long it was, everyone began clamoring for a new catechism. And so we got the new catechism of the Catholic Church. But actually our catechism should be the Bible. And we should work through the interpretations of the text of the Bible rather than writing a separate thing. But at this time, they printed and distributed catechisms, and they opened seminaries. But at this time, in the 1600s, catechisms were what they were used to, so they sort of expected it. And this reform that starts in the 1500s will continue for the next 400 years. So we're still in that. It's still, working through the church. Now we're going to look at some individuals again, and these are the post-Reformation, reform leaders, just as we saw a whole bunch of them attempt before the Reformation, and the church never took it on. Once the Reformation took place, and then the Council of Trent, which we call the Counter-Reformation, but when the Council of Trent took place, then we have these individuals rise, but it's very different now. They are not seen as obstacles to the church, but they're seen as an extension of what the church is doing. So, one of them is Philip Neary. Philip Neary was from Florence, but he made his home in the city of Rome. He became known eventually as the Apostle of Rome. He visited the sick, he preached. It was his great sense of humor that drew people to him. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He radiated simplicity and joy. In 1551, he was ordained and he became the most popular confessor in the city. Now, it seems to me someone with a great sense of humor wouldn't be a great confessor, but we'll go over that. So he organized concerts of sacred meetings, and his meetings were particularly effective for men and boys, and he called them spiritual carnivals. So he gathered them in what would be like a rock setting, and using music and this sort of things, and gatherings of people. I heard it one time described in a class as kind of like a Boy Scout jamboree. They were almost all men and boys, and gathered them together and stuff like that. But at that time in history, it would be considered unethical or anything to have girls in something that was overnight. So they wouldn't. But these would go on for several days. He was asked by the Pope to organize the priests who gathered around him, and they became known as the Oratory. The Pope saw this as such a powerful thing with the way the priests were coming together in reform that he asked Philip Neary to basically form an oratory and organize the lives of the priests around him. Philip decided not to organize a religious order, so he organized the Oratory. They did not take vows, and Philip had one rule. The rule is nothing but charity. That was his rule. They are known as the Oratory, and an oratory, I think you know oratory is a word for a little chapel where people pray, but the Oratory was a gathering of diocesan priests. And one of the things that became very evident, actually early in the church, and they've tried many ways to deal with it, is the idea of a priest living alone. It just is not healthy. And so the Oratory provided a community of priests, and the Oratory is founded much on what St. Augustine was about. You know, St. Augustine, when he formed his community, or the rule for his community, they had to be friends. So like if someone came in, they would live with us for a year, and if everyone, sort of entered a relationship of friendship with them, then they could vote to have the guy come part of the community. But if that didn't happen, they didn't. They wanted to be a group of friends, and they wanted to exhibit, by the way they lived, an enthusiasm and a love for the church. And so Philip Neary did that. Camillus de Lillis was the son of a Spanish soldier, and much like the military today, Spain was spread all over the world, much like, I should say, the United States today. But Spain owned Austria, Holland, the several areas in what we would call today Hungary, and those areas around there, Eastern Europe. And so there were lots of military outposts. And Camillus was the son of a Spanish soldier. He was raised on these outposts as his father was transferred, what did we call them? Army brats. But it's just a set kind of life. Becoming a soldier, he lost everything he had in card games and gamblings, and he had to turn in his free time to manual labor to pay off his debts. You see, military is kind of the same all the time. In 1575, he went through a spiritual conversion and became a priest. Incidentally, he was a good friend of the man we mentioned earlier, Philip Neary. And Philip Neary suggested he gather a group of priests around him and spend their lives in care of the sick. And so he founded this community. I think they're called can't think of the name of them now, but they when I was a youngster, they owned a large number of hospitals, and they were opening one in Salinas when I was up there. That was ultimately to be a place to care for the sick. I think it was to be called Villa Serra. And I think they opened it and got it going and everything, but they didn't have enough people to staff it. So it's held by a corporation today that runs it. But anyway, their community was given by the Pope the right to wear a red cross on their habit as a sign of their work. even at this point in history, the Red Cross was a sign of medicine. So they had like a white scapular in the front, and there was a large red cross woven in or painted. The Pope said of him that people said of him that he almost seemed to worship the sick as if they were Jesus himself. He insisted that care for the sick be carried out with the most up-to-date medical care and love, because the goal was the health of body, soul, personality, and life. And this is unusual. Do you know that if you watch the history of medicine and religion, even Catholic religion in reference to medicine, it's almost, do you pray to the saint or do you go to the doctor? And those things seems to be at odds. Camillus did not do that. If you went into his place, you had the whole religious background and everything, but simultaneously, you had absolutely the best medical care available. And we would expect that like in a Catholic hospital today. Now, another person from this time is Teresa of Avila, a Carmelite nun living in a huge convent of about 200 nuns in Avila, Spain. Now, these nuns had servants, wonderful food, and an extremely comfortable life, okay? So it was kind of like I'd use the term country club, but a country club-like atmosphere, except they were given to prayer. They had a habit, and they were given to prayer. But they had great food, everything was well taken care of, they had servants and this sort of thing. When I was a young student in the seminary in San Diego, the first college that was built that eventually became the University of San Diego was a college that was founded by the Religious of the Sacred Heart from France. And the Religious of the Sacred Heart and their history in France were sort of like the female equivalent of the Jesuits. I would say all the sisters had doctorates. They were very well educated. Simultaneously, there was a section of them that was actually servants, and they came in basically to be servants to the sisters. So the sisters had their job of teaching and everything, were free to do that. And this other group, servants, they did the food and the clean everything. Both of them were religious. The servants were not as well educated as the others, but I mean, they had college educations. They weren't stupid. And they just took care of the other sisters. And that was very, very common in religious orders back at this time. And that's what Teresa of Avila was doing. And as you can imagine, with 200 nuns, oftentimes they didn't even know one another. It was just a massive group. Teresa left the convent with 4 nuns, and they took up residence in a small house. They returned to the strict rule of their order: prayer, mortification, and communal life for the glory of God. They became known as discalced Carmelites. To discalce means to take off your shoes. When you see the Carmelite nuns today, discalced, they wear sandals, they don't wear shoes. And at this time, they were barefoot as a sign of penance. And so what she did was return them to their roots. And you may or may not know this, but the Vatican Council asked every religious order in the world to have meetings and to examine the religious life that their founders were living. And, you know, you think about it, let me just take Francis. Francis of Assisi, when he lived, was a magnet for people. Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, he was a magnet for people. Teresa of Avila was a magnet for people. And in the past few years, we've watched religious orders go way down in numbers. So what the Vatican said, look at what your founders were doing, because your founders attracted people amazingly. And that's true in any religious order. One we'd see today, Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa attracted people to her order. It was the fastest growing order in the church. And then over a period of time, oftentimes the lifestyle of the foundress or the founder appears to be too strict or too difficult, and we gradually sort of relax the things. And so the Pope called them to do that. But anyway, this is exactly what Teresa did. And she traveled all around Spain and founded convents. And a huge number of people came to her for the same reason. They were inspired by her life. And so they came in. She taught others by her example. And with the encouragement of her superiors, she wrote down her own spiritual exercises. And she is today one of the doctors of the church. I think she was the very first doctor of the church, female doctor of the church. The thing about Teresa of Avila, if you were to ever have an opportunity to read some of her writings, and if you decide you want to, don't buy a book until you go and can look at it for a little bit before you read it. Because obviously Teresa wrote always in Spanish, and you need to have a good translation so that you will read it. But she was very practical, and I may have told you this story, but she had a woman come to her in confession, and in those days they used to confess their sins to their superior in each house, and it was a way of reforming their lives. They didn't get absolution, it wasn't a sacrament, but they would confess their sins to their religious superior. And this nun had a whole list of things she went down. And when she got finished, Teresa of Avila asked her, she said, what do you do in the convent? And the sister said, well, I'm the cook. And they used to use big stoves that they put wood in. And so Teresa asked her, what do you do if a pot starts boiling over? She says, you hit it with the spoon. And, that puts the lid down and calms all the stuff inside for a while. And Teresa says, and if you have a bunch of pots, well, I just go around. And Teresa says, you keep doing that? And she says, yes. Teresa says, that's the problem with your spiritual life. You're trying to solve too many problems at once. She says, in a kitchen, what you should do is pick one pot, okay? Take it off the fire while the others boil over. Then take the second pot off the fire. And a lot of things will boil over in the period, but in the end, you'll have them all under control. And she says, that's what you need to do. Pick one thing in your life. See, that's genius. She was talking to a woman who was a cook, knew exactly what she meant, and could carry it through in her life. Teresa was one of the most practical people that ever came into religious life. Simultaneously, she was brilliant, and I mean brilliant. Teresa was a very brilliant person. Inspired by Teresa, there was a young Carmelite man who set out in 1568 to reform the male branch of the Carmelites. The Carmelites descend from a group of hermits that began meeting in Mount Carmel, and no one knows when they started. But a group of people went over to the Holy Land at a certain point in history and found these hermits living on Mount Carmel, and that became the foundation of the Carmelite order. These hermits up there had a great devotion to Mary under the title of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and so that's what they started. But as I mentioned, over a period of time, the order got very, very lax. As with any reformer, he met really terrible opposition and persecution. See, one of the nice things, Teresa had a lot of, opposition. But because she went out and actually started a new thing where people could come out and join her, she didn't have as many problems as John. John tried to reform a house. If you try and reform a house, there are a lot of people in there that are used to the easy life. They went in there for the easy life, and that's what they want. And so they become very, very great opposition to people. That's what we find going on with Pope Francis today. There are a lot of people very attached to the vestments, the jewelry, all this stuff connected with it, and they really resent the fact that Francis is reforming the papacy. Okay? His reform led to permission for the Carmelites to leave the monastery and work among the people. See, the Carmelite priests, like the Carmelite nuns, having descended from this group of hermits, actually all lived in a monastery. They didn't go out and do work in different areas, but he got permission from them to go out. His writings are powerfully mystical, and he is universally regarded as the greatest poet in the Spanish language. You can read translations of his work, and it's beautiful, but it doesn't compare with it in Spanish. I do not speak Spanish at all, and I could listen to a good reading of John of the Cross, listen to a good reading of John of the Cross in Spanish and really enjoy it. It is absolutely beautiful. But if you read Spanish at all, I'd encourage you to read some of him in Spanish. The work of these two Carmelites, John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, had absolutely nothing to do with the Catholic response to the Reformation. There was no Protestantism in Spain, which is where they were working. But it shows that the spirit of reform actually was sweeping the entire church. I'd like to tell you one of my favorite stories of Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila had mystical experiences with regards to God. And she lived in a dialogue with God. She would speak to God like you would speak to anyone. And this story actually illustrates it. She had been invited by a group of her nuns who had been able to build their convent. Incidentally, her rule was you could never have more than 12 nuns. She said if Jesus didn't feel he could deal with more than 12 people, we shouldn't either. So that as soon as you got 12 nuns, you'd wait till maybe 13 or 15, and then you break into 2 convents, and then you develop it. So she did that. But anyway, they were opening this convent. So she arrived, dressed very well, pulled up on her horse, and as she got off the horse, her foot caught in the stirrup, and she fell flat in the mud. And she stood up, and she looked up, and she said, "I thought you were a friend of mine." And what Jesus said to her is, "You are my friend. That's how I treat my friends." And Teresa of Avila looked up and said, "That's the reason you have so few." Okay? Excellent, excellent idea. Another example of this sort of thing, I'll take this one out of John of the Cross, the man. He was called to dedicate one of his monasteries. And one of the reasons why he's called John of the Cross, he could not look at a crucifix. That's a cross with the figure on it. We speak of crosses and crucifixes. He could not look at a crucifix and turn away from it. If he saw a crucifix, he went into this mystical state and wouldn't move on. He had to stay there a certain length of time and go. But anyway, he came to the dedication of a monastery. And if you've ever been in a monastery, you have a crucifix in every room. So John of the Cross came, and they knew very well what John of the Cross's problem was, so they had covered all of the crucifixes. So John of the Cross came in. When he came in the front door. Their monastery was built in a square around a patio with a fountain, and in the center of the fountain was a large crucifix. John came through the front door of the monastery, and while the corridors went off either side, if you went straight forward, there was a doorway, and that door was open. And when John of the Cross came through the door, he saw the crucifix, and he simply walked towards the crucifix. And as he was walking, his feet left the ground, and he was walking up until he stopped in front of this huge carved crucifix, eye-to-eye level with the crucifix, and he went into this state of ecstasy. So the monks, knowing it, they went off and had the party they were going to have after the dedication and waited for John to come down. When he came down, he dedicated the monastery. But these people had powerful, powerful relationship with God. In 1570, Europe was sharply divided between Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, and the Church of England. In Scotland, John Knox introduced a form of Calvinism France and his form of Calvinism, incidentally, became the Presbyterian Church. And John is regarded as the founder of the Presbyterian Church, John Knox. France was Catholic, but those favoring reform were slowly turning to Calvinism. In other words, I remember the reform of the church had been frustrated by different leaders all along, so they began to turn to Calvinism. Switzerland was divided into Protestant and Catholic cantons, and they were called Catholic or Reformed cantons. Their cantons sort of correspond to what we would call a county. Okay, they're legal districts. Some of them were Catholic, and some of them were Reformed. One of the interesting things about Switzerland is two groups of people that seem to be extremely tolerant historically were the Swiss and the Dutch. And so in both those cases, they came to a very early settlement that some people were going to be Catholic and some were going to be Protestant, and that was it. And so they just came part of that. The southern part of the Roman Empire and the Rhine and many smaller areas in Germany remained Catholic. Okay? So the bulk of Germany, land-wise, most of it was Reformed, Lutheran. But there was a lot of Catholic, principally in the south. In fact, I think I mentioned this before. If you look at the line that divided the Russian section of Germany after the war from the French, English, and American sectors, that line separates the two. The area the communists had was basically Lutheran Germany, and the area that became West Germany was in fact the Catholic section. Elsewhere, there were many Lutherans and some Calvinists. Many violent encounters between Calvinists and the Lutherans were taking place. Okay? So now, remember, the reform began with Luther, and as Luther began his reform, people believed Calvin had gone too far. And so the Lutherans now were fighting the Catholics on one side, the Calvinists on the other. But the Calvinists and the Lutherans came into very strong conflicts during this period. Catholics were the majority in the Netherlands. Luthers and Anabaptists were dwindling, while the Calvinists were growing. And again, Calvin took the basic teachings of Luther and took them just one step further. So a lot of people who were Lutheran began now to turn to the Calvinists. The Anabaptists and the Lutherans were actually dwindling, but Calvinists were growing. Poland remained Catholic, although it sheltered many small communities of different denominations that were under persecution in other areas. Poland proved to be a pretty tolerant area for religions. It was perhaps the most tolerant of the nations. So Poland was considered the most tolerant of all the nations. In the lands held by the Ottoman Turks, the Orthodox were the Christians. There was divisions and violence was growing. Lutherans were suffering from internal disputes, and the Calvinists and the Catholics were growing. So the Lutherans are going through terrible times now. Catholics were enjoying the benefits of the reforms of Trent. And again, you know, I cannot tell you, let me just say, when I was in Spreckles, we had a number of Protestant ministers join Spreckles after they retired. And it's because they saw the church that was created by Vatican II, the Reformed Church. And had they been able to, at the time, they would have been Catholics. Had that been the Catholic Church of their youth, they would have been Catholics. But they were ordained ministers, they were married, so they couldn't come in and become priests, and they were taking care of their own congregations. And what we see at this time with the reforms of Trent, many people who had left came back. And it's not unusual today to hear a Protestant minister say that if Francis were Pope when I was a child, I'd be a Catholic today. It's just, you know, it has to do with the way the church appears or lives. Religious disputes now became increasingly violent. In France, the Calvinists were called the Huguenot, and they were involved in a dispute with the Catholics over who would inherit the French throne if the ruling Valois family were to die out. Okay? So the ruling family was called the Valois, and they believed historically in the divine right of kings, that there was something about royal blood that made you special or different. So as a result of this, they couldn't just elect someone else king and their family would go on, although England eventually did that with William and Mary in order to get away from Catholics. But in this case, the French weren't going to do that. But one of the major contesting families was Huguenot, and they were next in line basically to assume the throne. The Bourbons, which is the family of the Huguenots, were clearly the next in line for the throne. Civil war broke out in 1562, and in 1572, Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, encouraged the fiercely anti-Protestant people of Paris into a massacre of the Huguenots. And at a certain night, they had the Catholics went into homes and everything and killed Huguenots all over the city of Paris. I would compare the event to Kristallnacht, when the Nazis burned all the synagogues in Germany on a particular night. And the people of Paris were very strongly Catholic, but they were even more anti-Protestant than they were Catholic. So in 1593, Henry V, a Protestant from the Bourbon family, became king. The interesting thing is, he was a Huguenot. As soon as he became king, he converted to the Catholic Church. And he issued a decree giving freedom of worship to Protestants, the Huguenots, and peace was restored. So he himself was a Protestant. When he became king, he became a Catholic, but gave freedom of religion to the Protestants. So the Catholics were happy, they had their king. The Protestants were happy, they had freedom of religion. And he ended the conflicts there. The Netherlands were under the rulership of King Philip II of Spain, who was a fiercely Catholic king. Historically, the Spanish royalty, in fact, I would say generally the Catholic Church in Spain, was Catholic with a vengeance. And that's because they had been under the Muslims for so long, the Ottoman Turks. And they saw the whole thing of religion as being more nationalistic almost than religion. And that's one of the reasons why the difficulties we had in the Franciscan missions in California. The priests were all Spanish. Catholics were strong in the south, but the Calvinists were growing in the north. And Philip in Spain began a persecution of Protestants in the Netherlands. There was a very long conflict, and the country finally won its independence. Now, thanks to the great trade center, Amsterdam, Holland became one of the wealthiest countries in the entire world. In 1618, strict Calvinism was accepted as the official religion. Again, there was not really a big persecution of Catholics, but the official religion was Calvinism. In England, Elizabeth became queen in 1558, and the Church of England was firmly established. I want you to know that when Henry VIII broke off from Rome, if you were in a little village in England, you would never know anything had changed. The man who was your pastor when it was a Catholic church would be your pastor now that it was Church of England. The doctrines weren't changed, the hymns weren't changed, the ceremonies weren't changed, nothing was changed. You had to be in, London to even know something had happened. But according to tradition, I heard this as a tradition thing, when Henry VIII was followed, I think, by a child who ruled just for a couple months. But after the child, the one who came in was Mary Tudor, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And so she came in. She was militantly Catholic and is known today as Bloody Mary. She's the one who prosecuted all the Protestants. And when she died, her sister followed, Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth was taking over, the Pope decided to try and intervene to try and bring Elizabeth into the Catholic tradition and this sort of thing. And so the Pope sent, I understand, an archbishop from Ireland to meet with Elizabeth. But the difficulty was, in his meeting with Elizabeth, he constantly referred to her as the bastard. And again, she was born of the marriage with Anne Boleyn that was never recognized by the church. And at the end of that meeting, Elizabeth was militantly anti-Catholic. We have no idea how she felt about the church before that, but she was militantly anti-Catholic. And up to this point, you don't find people, even Henry VIII wasn't militantly anti-Catholic. He was militantly anti-anyone who did not recognize him as head of the church, okay? But he wasn't against the church, particularly at that time. And so she appointed a priest who had been ordained before the break with Rome as Archbishop of Canterbury. So now she appointed a priest, not a bishop. Now he was an ordained priest, John Kramer, and he became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he began to ordain other priests, other bishops. He consecrated bishops and ordained priests. If you've ever wondered why the Catholic Church is suspicious of the sequence or the power of the religious orders in the Anglican and the Episcopal Church, is because of this, because their orders descend from a guy who was not a bishop. He was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury by Elizabeth, and he consecrated bishops, but he was never consecrated a bishop unless he was by Elizabeth, I don't know. And he ordained priests, which a priest isn't allowed to do. And she was named the supreme governor of the church. Theologically, she took a middle path between the Catholics and the Protestants. She was not Protestant in the Calvinistic sense, but she was not Protestant in the Henry VIII sense either. She was sort of middle between the two. I find her approach to theology being very close to Luther. Okay, now Calvinism is sort of a radical move of the Lutheran tradition, but I think she would have passed as a good Lutheran. Puritanism grew out of the Church of England by a small but growing group of people who wanted to have a truly biblical way of life for both the individual and the society. You see, what's going on now is you're beginning to recognize that we have these countries with pockets of Catholics and pockets of Protestants. So the government of a society oftentimes was not of a particular religion, because the different religions had to live under it. So it really wasn't that. But these people wanted a government that was true to the biblical thing. And of course, they didn't have that in England at all. Because of conflicts with the Church of England, many of them would eventually come to America. And the Puritans, and see, they wanted a pure religion. That's where they got. You can tell an awful lot about Protestant religions from their name. Like, for instance, the Puritans wanted a religion that was purely biblical. They wanted to get away from everything else. As I told you, Elizabeth made a compromise. So the Anglican Church is not purely biblical and not purely Catholic, okay? So it isn't either. And so the Puritans wanted purely biblical, and so that's what they took. John Wesley and his brother broke from the Church of England too. And they broke from the Church of England because they did not like the method of worship. They said the worship was far too formal. So we call them Methodists. The Quakers used to have their meetings, and when they felt the inspiration of the Spirit, they'd oftentimes shake like this. So they were called Quakers. But if you watch through, the name of a Protestant religion usually tells you something about its founding, or it's the name of its founder. Lutherans, this sort of things. And Presbyterians, their community is not ruled by a pastor, an individual parish, but by a presbytery, a gathering of a group of people. We mentioned that when we were studying Calvin. Okay, so many of the Puritans, which grew out of the Church of England, moved to America. Up to this point, we're looking at about maybe 1600. Up to 1600, Protestant churches basically broke off from the Catholic. Now, once that had happened, beginning around 1600, we will watch their churches break off from the Protestant churches too. And the Protestants have a more difficult time with this than we do, because the Protestants were founded on their ability to walk away from the Catholic Church. So they have great difficulty if a group within them decides to walk away from them. And so they broke down into many, many different things. 1622. At this time, the many missionaries of the Catholic Church were spreading all over the world under the authority of the government of the country of origin. Now, this is very important. Remember, the missionaries who came to California were under the authority of the Spanish government, okay? The missionaries that went to Canada, that came to the area where my family is from, were Jesuits, but they were under the authority of France. They were French Jesuits. So the authority over the missions really was exercised more by the government than the church. Missionaries would find themselves oftentimes in conflict with merchants, soldiers, and secular authorities. And missionaries were really in serious danger all over the world of actually ending up civil employees. Pope Gregory XV founded the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. And we probably know them for the collection we take each year. We take a collection each year in the Catholic Church. Every church, Catholic church in the world takes it for the propagation of the faith. And what happens, bishops were created to take charge of the church in mission lands. So it's no longer the, the authority. I'll tell you the big change this made, that when the authority was the Spanish government over the Spanish missions in South America and California and stuff, every bishop they appointed was from Spain. As soon as the propagation of the faith took over, they looked to appoint indigenous, people who were from the United States. And they did that all over the world. So the missionaries that came in, and that's why, we had so many Irish clergy when I was a youngster, because if you look at the history of the United States, the two groups that basically came into the United States as Catholics initially were Germans and were, Germans and Irish. And this is after the early missionary period. But the missionaries that came in were from Germany and Ireland. But they were under the propagation of the faith. They were no longer under their government. So their government didn't appoint the things. There were just a lot of priests from these two countries. This new congregation forbade missionaries to be involved in commercial or political matters. And the idea of political matters, an example would be there were a lot of clergy involved in the Inquisition in Spain. And the Inquisition was in North and South America when the Spanish were over here. That Inquisition was a function of their government because they considered to be Catholic to be Spanish. If you weren't really Catholic, then you were an enemy of the Spanish government. And so they forbid missionaries to be involved in those. And where they were involved in commercial matters, where the missionaries were expected, as they converted these people and trained them, let's say the Native Americans, they were to work on the plantations and build up a Spanish society. So they were being trained commercially. They were to be specifically trained for mission work and given the goal of establishing a native clergy. The sign that you had been successful in your work was when a native person was ordained a priest. The community that I was in, was ordained in, was the Maris. And the Maris were founded with the mission of converting Oceania, which is Hawaii, Tahiti, Samoa, all those things. And probably the high point of their missionary activity was when in Samoa, the archbishop was appointed a cardinal. Now that was a sign the native clergy had really taken over. And so that's the goal of a missionary thing. A missionary society wants to get this going and then turn it over. They were to defend and support the customs of the peoples. Now remember how different that was when the Spanish came here. The Spanish tried to turn the Native Americans into Spanish citizens. Now they were to respect the customs of the peoples. It proved to be very difficult for the Europeans religion from Europe to separate the European religion from European customs. And until recent times, this aspect of missionary work was not very successful. I don't know if many of you are familiar, but depending on what highway you take going from, let's say, San Luis Obispo to San Francisco, in the area of, I think, about Palo Alto, you'll notice on a hill above the highway a very Chinese-looking building and a couple of buildings there. And that's actually belonged to the Marinol. And the Marinol Missions, they were Americans. The Marinol was founded by Americans, and they were missionaries to China. But what you would do is you would go into that Marinol house and you would learn to speak Chinese, you'd learn to eat Chinese food, you'd learn to dress Chinese. You were as Chinese as they could make you, and they did it in this environment. And then you go into the missions. And that has proved to be extremely successful. But it was hard for a while to get away. Like, for instance, no matter how dedicated I might be to Native American culture, because I've learned a lot of it and I've lived with it and this sort of thing, I am not qualified to teach it. You'd have to actually take someone who was Native American, raised, and then have them do it, okay? In the 1600s, a terrible persecution broke out against the church, and many, many were martyred. This is persecution in Japan. The imperial regent of Japan expelled the Jesuits because of a growing fear that the missionaries would be followed by Europeans seeking to control Japan. Remember, that's what happened with the Spanish missionaries in California. But that had stopped at this point. But still, the Japanese were looking at what had happened in places like California, and they did not want that to happen. In 1614, there were 300,000 Catholics in Japan, as well as many missionaries, and there was a mass killing of Christians and the prohibition of any communication with European countries. More than 200,000 Catholics were killed. They forbid communication with the European countries. So if you were a missionary here, let's say a missionary in Japan, you could not communicate with any European country at all. So they weren't allowed to send letters back and forth and stuff like that. And large numbers were killed. There was a movie done last year about the persecution of the Jesuits in Japan. I wish I could remember the name of the movie, but it was an excellent movie. And it showed how terrible the persecution was. The Japanese, at the beginning of the persecution, created a city that had never existed before, the city of Nagasaki. And they used it as an area for all Catholics, or Christians, I think. All Christians in Japan were to move to Nagasaki so that it wouldn't influence their people. But once they had them controlled there, it was easy to kill them. And Nagasaki remains to this day the center of Catholicism in Japan. And if I remember correctly, when the atomic bomb landed on Nagasaki, something like 2/3 of all the Catholics in Japan died. And just a huge number died. When Japan was opened to the West in 1865, it was discovered that there was still a small Catholic community that carried on in secret. Without clergy, they taught their children the faith, and the strongest strain of Catholicism that held them together was actually devotion to the Virgin Mary. I'd like to tell you the story of the arrival of the Americans with Perry. When Perry arrived in Tokyo and got off the boat, with him were 2 Catholic priests. And they were chaplains to the sailors in the fleet of ships. And anyway, a man came up to one of the priests and he asked 2 questions. He said, "Do you have a father in Rome?" Now remember, at this time, Japan had not been communicating with Europe. So they just knew a father in Rome. They didn't know where Rome was or anything like that. And he said, "Yes." He says, "Do you have a mother in heaven?" And he said, "Yes." And he asked the priest if he would come with him that night. As the Catholic priest went with him that night, and there was a massive gathering of Catholics. And in the center of it was a small wooden box that they worshiped. And they had this whole ceremony going on. And we since have figured out that that small wooden box was actually what Eucharist had been used to carry the Eucharist to the sick. It was a pyx. And what happened was in the 1600s they were closed, and in the middle of the 1800s they were open. And those people preserved the faith. They had no clergy, nothing, no churches, but they preserved the faith. And they were received in and taught the Catholic Church, the doctrine, everything that they hadn't heard before. Anyway, we'll stop it there and pick it up there next week.